Imagine spending your life savings on a crumbling greenhouse that everyone said was cursed, thinking you just found a quiet place to grow tomatoes and forget your troubles. But when Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped through the shattered glass doors of Willowbrook Conservatory, she discovered something that would challenge everything modern medicine thought it knew about healing. Hidden among the tangled vines and decades of neglect was a single plant that shouldn't have existed, one that would lead to the most groundbreaking medical discovery of the century. What she found growing in that forgotten corner wasn't just surviving against all odds, it was thriving, and it held the key to curing a disease that had claimed millions of lives. Stay with me, because in the next hour, you'll hear a story so extraordinary it will make you question what we've lost in our rush toward progress, and what miracles might be hiding in the places we've forgotten to look. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Dr. Sarah Mitchell signed the papers for the abandoned Willowbrook Conservatory, her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the pen. At 45, she had just walked away from a 20-year career in pharmaceutical research, burned every bridge she'd built in the medical community, and was about to spend the last of her savings on what everyone in the small town of Cedar Falls, Vermont, called Henderson's Folly. The real estate agent, a nervous woman named Patricia Coleman, kept glancing at Sarah like she was watching someone make the worst decision of their life. "You're absolutely sure about this, Dr. Mitchell?" Patricia asked for the third time, her voice tight with concern. "I mean, the structure needs extensive repairs. There's no heating system, and honestly, most folks around here think the place is, well, they think it brings bad luck." Sarah looked up from the contract, her green eyes steady, despite the tremor in her fingers. "I'm sure," she said quietly. But the truth was, she wasn't sure about anything anymore. She wasn't sure about leaving her position as head researcher at Meridian Pharmaceuticals. She wasn't sure about abandoning her comfortable Boston apartment for a ramshackle greenhouse in rural Vermont, and she certainly wasn't sure about the whispers that had followed her out of the medical community, whispers that called her obsessed, reckless, even dangerous. What she was sure about was that she couldn't continue living the lie her career had become. For 2 decades, she had watched promising research get buried when it threatened profit margins. She'd seen miracle compounds shelved because they couldn't be patented, and breakthrough treatments killed in committee rooms because they didn't fit the business model. The final straw had come 6 months earlier, when her team discovered a promising treatment for Huntington's disease, a degenerative neurological condition that had no cure and a guaranteed death sentence. The compound they had isolated from a rare Brazilian moss showed remarkable results in early trials, but when Sarah presented the findings to the board, she was told the project was being discontinued. The reason? The patient population was too small to justify the investment. That night, she had sat in her sterile laboratory, staring at the samples of Brazilian moss under fluorescent lights, and something inside her broke. She thought of her younger brother, David, who had died from Huntington's at 32, and of the thousands of other families watching their loved ones slip away while potentially life-saving treatments gathered dust on corporate shelves. She had gone into medicine to heal people, not to maximize shareholder value. The confrontation with her supervisor, Dr. Richard Pemberton, still echoed in her mind. "You're being emotional, Sarah," he said, his voice patronizing and cold. "This is business. We can't save everyone, and we certainly can't save everyone at a loss." When she pressed him, demanding to know what had happened to the research, he leaned back in his leather chair and smiled that thin, corporate smile she had come to despise. "The samples have been disposed of. The research is classified. And if you continue pushing this, you'll find yourself without a position here." That's when Sarah made the decision that would change her life forever. That night, she had taken the remaining samples of the Brazilian moss, samples that were scheduled for incineration, and smuggled them out of the lab. She told herself she was preserving important research, but deep down she knew she was stealing. The guilt had eaten at her for months, but not as much as the thought of letting a potential cure disappear forever. Now, 6 months later, she sat in a small-town real estate office, about to purchase an abandoned greenhouse with money she'd gotten from selling everything she owned. Her colleagues thought she had lost her mind. Her sister in California had begged her to reconsider. Even her closest friends had stopped returning her calls when she started talking about alternative research methods and getting back to the roots of botanical medicine. The Willowbrook Conservatory had been built in 1962 by Dr. James Henderson, a botanist who had dedicated his life to studying medicinal plants. For 30 years, it had been a thriving research facility, attracting scientists from all over the world who came to study Henderson's extensive collection of rare specimens. But Henderson was, by all accounts, an eccentric man who kept detailed records of his work in handwritten journals and trusted no one with his most important research. When he died suddenly of a heart attack in 1995, his work had died with him. His family, uninterested in botany and eager to settle his estate, had tried to sell the conservatory multiple times over the past 28 years, but no buyer had ever followed through.
And somewhere in the back of her mind, she thought of her brother David and the promise she had made to him as he lay dying, that she would never stop fighting for the people medicine had forgotten. Today, she was finally making good on that promise. The first morning Sarah woke up in the small caretaker's cottage behind the conservatory, she almost convinced herself the entire purchase had been an elaborate nightmare. The cottage was barely habitable, a one-bedroom structure with peeling paint, a temperamental heating system that coughed and wheezed through the night, and plumbing that seemed to have been installed sometime during the Eisenhower administration. But as she stood at the cottage's single window, sipping instant coffee from a chipped mug and staring at the massive glass structure that now belonged to her, reality settled over her like a heavy blanket. She owned this place, all 2 acres of it. The twisted metal framework, the thousands of broken glass panels, the jungle of overgrown vegetation that had consumed what had once been carefully organized research plots. And somewhere in that chaos, she hoped to find something that would justify the complete upheaval of her life. Her first real exploration of the conservatory's interior was both more and less overwhelming than she had anticipated. Armed with work gloves, pruning shears, and a notebook, she entered through what had once been the main entrance. The heavy glass doors still functioned, though they required significant effort to open, their hinges protesting with groans that echoed through the vast space. The smell hit her immediately, not unpleasant, but intensely organic. It was the scent of earth and growth and decay all mingled together, the kind of rich, loamy atmosphere you might find in an old-growth forest. But this wasn't a forest. This was what remained of Dr. Henderson's life's work, transformed by 3 decades of neglect into something that resembled a botanical fever dream. Vines hung from the framework like green curtains, some thick as her wrist, creating natural corridors and hidden chambers throughout the space. Trees that had once been small specimens in pots now reached toward the broken ceiling, their branches intertwining with the metal supports. Flowering plants she couldn't identify bloomed in impossible profusion, creating splashes of color, deep purples, brilliant oranges, electric blues that seemed almost artificial in their intensity. But it was the organization that surprised her most. Despite the wild overgrowth, she could still see the bones of Henderson's original system. Raised beds ran in neat rows through sections of the conservatory, though they were now barely visible beneath layers of vegetation. Faded plastic labels still clung to stakes here and there, their writing too weathered to read, but serving as reminders that this chaos had once been a carefully curated collection. Sarah spent her first week simply mapping the space, creating a rough floor plan in her notebook and trying to identify different zones. The conservatory was larger than she had realized, much larger. The main growing area was divided into several distinct sections that seemed to have been organized by climate and growing conditions. There was a humid tropical zone near the south wall, where massive broad-leafed plants created a canopy that filtered the sunlight into green-tinted shadows. A desert section in the northwest corner housed cacti and succulents that had grown into bizarre sculptural forms. An entire wing seemed to have been devoted to what she assumed were temperate plants, though it was now so overgrown she couldn't be sure what was growing there. Most intriguingly, There was an area in the center of the conservatory that appeared to have been Henderson's workspace. The framework here rose into a second story, creating a mezzanine level accessible by a narrow metal staircase. On the upper level, she found what remained of Dr. Henderson's laboratory, workbenches covered with decades of dust, microscopes wrapped in plastic sheeting, and filing cabinets whose drawers had warped shut from humidity. The lower level beneath the mezzanine was equally fascinating. Here, Henderson had constructed what could only be described as a propagation facility, hundreds of small pots and seedling trays arranged on tables, most now empty, but some still containing the desiccated remains of whatever Henderson had been growing when he died. Along one wall, she found a series of glass cases that might have been used for controlled experiments, and in the corner, a sophisticated-looking distillation setup that suggested Henderson had been extracting compounds from his plants rather than simply studying them. But Henderson's record-keeping system both impressed and frustrated her. The man had been meticulous to the point of obsession, but he had also been deeply paranoid about his work. She found journals everywhere, stacked on shelves, tucked into drawers, even hidden in waterproof containers buried among the plants. Each journal was filled with Henderson's cramped handwriting, documenting every aspect of his research in exhaustive detail. The problem was that his system was entirely idiosyncratic. He had developed his own shorthand, his own classification system, his own method of cross-referencing between journals. Sarah spent hours each evening in the cottage trying to decode Henderson's notes by lamplight. Gradually, a picture began to emerge of a brilliant but increasingly isolated man who had become convinced that he was on the verge of revolutionary discoveries that the scientific establishment would never accept. His early journals, dating from the 1960s and 70s, were relatively conventional. Careful observations of plant growth, detailed records of soil conditions and environmental factors, methodical documentation of flowering cycles and seed production.
But as the years progressed, Henderson's work had taken increasingly unconventional turns. By the 1980s, his journals were filled with references to synergistic compounds, bioactive matrices, and plant consciousness protocols that sounded more like science fiction than serious botany. He had become obsessed with the idea that plants had evolved sophisticated chemical communication systems that could be harnessed for human benefit, particularly in treating diseases that conventional medicine couldn't address. One journal entry from 1989 particularly caught Sarah's attention. The pharmaceutical industry is looking in the wrong places. They want to isolate single compounds, synthesize them artificially, and mass-produce them for profit. But nature doesn't work that way. The healing power is in the combinations, the subtle interactions between dozens or even hundreds of different molecules working in harmony. Strip away that complexity, and you lose the magic. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten Sarah into trouble at Meridian Pharmaceuticals. The idea that natural compounds might be more effective in their original context than as isolated, synthesized drugs was considered heresy in modern pharmaceutical research. But Henderson had taken the concept much further than Sarah had ever dared to imagine. According to his journals, Henderson had spent his final years developing what he called symbiotic cultivation techniques, methods for growing different plant species together in ways that enhanced their individual medicinal properties. He had documented dozens of successful experiments where combinations of plants had produced compounds that neither species created when grown in isolation. More remarkably, he claimed to have developed several plant combinations that showed promising effects against diseases that conventional medicine considered incurable. The more Sarah read, the more she realized that Henderson's work hadn't been the eccentric hobby of a reclusive botanist. It had been serious, groundbreaking research that had been dismissed and forgotten simply because it didn't fit the accepted paradigms of pharmaceutical science. Henderson had been asking the same questions that had driven Sarah from her corporate position, questions about why nature seemed to hold answers that laboratory science couldn't replicate. But Henderson's journals also revealed the cost of his isolation. His later entries became increasingly bitter and paranoid. He wrote about feeling watched,
about competitors trying to steal his research, about government agencies that wanted to suppress his discoveries. Whether these fears had been justified or simply the product of a brilliant mind under too much pressure, Sarah couldn't determine. What was clear was that Henderson had died a lonely, frightened man who believed his life's work would die with him. Now, as Sarah stood among the overgrown remnants of his research, she felt the weight of that legacy settling on her shoulders. Henderson's journals contained detailed references to specific plant specimens, to particular combinations and cultivation techniques, to experiments that had yielded promising results. But 30 years of neglect had transformed his carefully organized collection into chaos. Plants had crossbred, moved beyond their original boundaries, evolved in response to changing conditions. The living library of Henderson's research had become scrambled, its organization lost. Yet as she walked through the conservatory each morning, Sarah began to sense that not everything had been lost. There were patterns in the chaos, places where certain plants seemed to cluster together, combinations that had persisted despite the lack of human intervention. It was as if Henderson's experimental partnerships had continued to develop on their own, guided by natural processes that human hands had merely initiated. The challenge would be untangling 30 years of growth and change to rediscover what Henderson had found. Sarah had no research team, no sophisticated laboratory equipment, no institutional support. She had her experience, her intuition, and the cryptic journals of a dead botanist who had been dismissed as a crackpot by his contemporaries. But she also had something that Henderson had never possessed: the desperate urgency of someone who had already lost everything and had nothing left to lose. As she made her plans for beginning the work in earnest, Sarah thought again of her brother David and of all the people who were dying while potential cures gathered dust in corporate filing cabinets or moldered away in abandoned greenhouses. She had come here to find something worth saving. Now she realized that maybe, just maybe, it had been here waiting for her all along. 3 weeks into her residency at the conservatory, Sarah made her first breakthrough, though at the time she didn't recognize it as such. She had been working methodically through Henderson's cultivation zones, trying to match his journal descriptions to the reality of what now grew in each section. It was painstaking work, complicated by the fact that many of his plant labels had either disappeared entirely or become too weathered to read. She had established a routine that began before dawn and often extended well past sunset. Each morning, she would select a small section of the conservatory to focus on, carefully documenting what she found there with photographs and detailed notes. She would sketch the plants, measure their dimensions, and collect small samples for later examination under the microscope she had managed to restore in Henderson's old laboratory. Her evenings were spent cross-referencing her observations with Henderson's journals, trying to decode his cryptic notation system and piece together what each area had originally been designed to study. The work was physically exhausting and mentally frustrating. For every journal entry she managed to decipher, 3 more remained incomprehensible. For every plant she successfully identified, a dozen others defied classification. The conservatory's ecosystem had evolved far beyond what Henderson could have predicted, creating hybrid forms in unexpected combinations that existed nowhere in botanical literature. But Sarah had learned patience during her years in pharmaceutical research, and she approached each day's work with the systematic persistence that had once made her valuable to Meridian Pharmaceuticals. She was building a database, creating a new map of Henderson's legacy that might eventually reveal patterns invisible to casual observation.
The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in late October. Sarah had been working in what Henderson's journals referred to as Sector 7C, a humid corner of the conservatory where dense tropical vegetation created a microenvironment that felt more like a rainforest than a greenhouse. The temperature here was consistently 10 degrees warmer than the rest of the building, and the air hung thick with moisture that condensed on every surface. She'd been struggling to clear a path through a tangle of vines that had grown so densely it was impossible to see what lay beyond them. The vines themselves were extraordinary, thick as her arm in some places, with leaves that shifted color throughout the day, appearing deep green in the morning light, but showing hints of purple and gold as the sun moved across the sky. Henderson had made several references to what he called chromatic adaptation species in his journals, but Sarah had assumed he was speaking metaphorically. As she worked to cut through the vine mass with a pair of heavy pruning shears, she began to notice something unusual about the plant's response to being cut. Most plants, when pruned, would ooze clear sap or perhaps darken at the cut site, but these vines released a faint, almost luminescent fluid that seemed to shimmer with its own light. More remarkable still, within hours of being cut, the vines would begin to regenerate, not just healing the wound, but actually growing new shoots from the cut site at a rate that seemed to violate everything Sarah knew about plant biology. Intrigued, she collected samples of the luminescent sap and retreated to Henderson's laboratory for a closer look. Under the microscope, the fluid revealed a complex structure unlike anything she had encountered in her botanical studies. The sap contained what appeared to be specialized cells that pulsed with regular rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. When she added a drop of the fluid to a slide containing human blood cells, she had pricked her own finger for the sample. The interaction was immediate and dramatic. The blood cells, which had been showing signs of typical degradation under laboratory conditions, suddenly became more active. Their membranes appeared to strengthen, their internal structures became more defined, and most remarkably, cells that had been damaged began to repair themselves. Sarah watched in fascination as cellular regeneration occurred at a rate she had never witnessed outside of certain cancer cell lines. But this regeneration was controlled, organized, healthy. She spent the entire day running variations of the experiment, testing the sap against different types of human tissue samples, adjusting concentrations, and documenting every observable effect. The results were consistent and extraordinary. The vine sap appeared to contain compounds that could dramatically accelerate cellular repair and regeneration in human tissue. But unlike the uncontrolled growth associated with cancer, this regeneration followed normal cellular patterns and stopped when the tissue reached its optimal state. That evening, Sarah sat in the cottage with Henderson's journal spread across her kitchen table, searching frantically for any reference to the remarkable vine she had discovered. She found the first mention buried in a journal from 1991, where Henderson had noted, "The Lazarus specimens continue to exceed all expectations. Cellular regeneration rates approach theoretical maximums while maintaining perfect organizational integrity. If these results can be replicated and concentrated, we may have found the key to addressing degenerative cellular processes in human subjects." Lazarus specimens. The name sent a chill through Sarah as she realized what Henderson had been suggesting. He hadn't just been studying interesting plants, he had been developing potential treatments for diseases characterized by cellular degeneration. Diseases like Huntington's, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and dozens of other conditions that conventional medicine could slow but never reverse. She found more references as she searched deeper into Henderson's files. The Lazarus vines, as Henderson had called them, had been one of his most promising discoveries, but also his most closely guarded secret. According to his notes, the vines were not a single species, but rather a symbiotic combination of 3 different plants that had been trained to grow together in such intimate partnership that they had essentially become a single organism. The luminescent sap was produced only when all 3 component species were healthy and properly integrated. Henderson had spent years perfecting the cultivation technique required to maintain the symbiotic relationship. His journals detailed a complex regimen of soil amendments, lighting schedules, humidity controls, and even what he described as harmonic frequency treatments. Apparently, Henderson had discovered that the vines responded positively to certain sound frequencies and had installed a system of speakers throughout Sector 7C to provide what he called botanical music therapy. More disturbing were Henderson's notes about his attempts to share his discovery with the medical community. He had submitted papers to several prestigious journals, all of which had rejected his work without peer review. He had approached pharmaceutical companies, only to be dismissed as a crank, or, in one case, to have his research samples confiscated by corporate security under the pretext of protecting trade secrets. By 1993, Henderson had stopped trying to publish his findings altogether, focusing instead on perfecting his cultivation techniques and documenting his results in increasingly detailed private journals. The final journal entries related to the Lazarus vines were both heartbreaking and prophetic. Henderson had begun to suspect that his discovery was too valuable and too disruptive to be allowed to reach the public. He wrote about feeling watched, about strangers asking questions in town about his work, about phone calls that ended when he answered. Whether his paranoia had been justified or not, it was clear that Henderson had spent his final years in fear, convinced that powerful interests wanted to suppress his research.
In his last entry about the Lazarus Project, dated just 3 months before his death, Henderson had written, "I have taken precautions to ensure the survival of the specimens, even if I cannot survive to continue the work. The symbiotic cultivation protocols are encoded in the growing medium itself. The plants will maintain their partnership as long as the environmental conditions remain stable. Perhaps someday, someone with the courage I lacked will find them and finish what I began." As Sarah read these words by lamplight in the cottage's small kitchen, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror that reminded her of her first day in medical school, when she had realized that she was about to spend her life dealing with matters of life and death. Henderson's discovery, if it was genuine, represented exactly the kind of breakthrough that could revolutionize medicine. But it also represented the kind of threat to established interests that had apparently cost Henderson his peace of mind, and possibly his life. She thought of her former colleagues at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, of the board meetings where promising research had been killed for purely financial reasons, of the executives who had made it clear that their primary loyalty was to shareholders rather than patients. If Henderson's paranoia had been justified, then Sarah had just stumbled into the middle of a conflict between medical science and corporate power that was far larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But as she sat there in the cottage, surrounded by Henderson's journals and the faint scent of the luminescent vine sap still clinging to her hands, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Real, tangible hope that she might have found something worth all the sacrifices she had made. The Lazarus vines were still alive, still producing their remarkable sap, still maintaining the symbiotic relationship that Henderson had spent years perfecting. Tomorrow, she would begin the real work of understanding what she had found. She would test the sap more rigorously, document its effects more precisely, and begin the long process of determining whether Henderson's claims could withstand scientific scrutiny. But tonight, for the first time since she had walked away from her corporate career, Sarah allowed herself to believe that she might actually be on the verge of something extraordinary. She had come to the conservatory looking for redemption. Instead, she had found something that might be even more valuable: a chance to honor her brother's memory by continuing the fight against diseases that conventional medicine had declared unwinnable. If Henderson had been right, if the Lazarus vines truly held the key to cellular regeneration, then Sarah's exile from the pharmaceutical industry might have led her to the most important discovery of her career. The question now was whether she would have the courage and the resources to see that discovery through to its conclusion, knowing that the same forces that had apparently silenced Henderson might soon turn their attention to her. The next 6 weeks transformed Sarah from a hopeful researcher into something approaching a woman possessed. She threw herself into studying the Lazarus vines with an intensity that would have concerned anyone who had been there to witness it. But there was no one to witness it. Just Sarah, the plants, and the ghost of Henderson's abandoned work. She began each day before sunrise, not because she had to, but because sleep had become elusive. Her dreams were filled with cellular structures dancing under microscope lights, with the pulsing rhythm of the vine sap, with her brother David's face as it had looked in his final days when the Huntington's disease had stolen everything that made him himself. She would wake with her heart racing and her mind already spinning with new experiments to try, new variables to test. The makeshift laboratory she had established in Henderson's old workspace became the center of her universe. Using equipment she had purchased with her dwindling savings and instruments she had salvaged from Henderson's collection, Sarah began the most rigorous testing protocol she had ever attempted outside of a major pharmaceutical facility. She was acutely aware that without the resources of a corporate lab, without electron microscopes, mass spectrometers, and the army of graduate students who typically support this kind of research, she was working at a severe disadvantage. But she was also free from the constraints that had hampered her corporate work, the endless meetings, the budget approvals, the oversight committees that could kill a promising line of research with a single vote. Her first major breakthrough came when she successfully isolated the active compounds in the vine sap. Working with Henderson's vintage but still functional chromatography equipment, she discovered that the luminescent fluid contained not one, but 17 distinct chemical compounds arranged in a complex molecular matrix that seemed to provide each individual compound with enhanced stability and bioactivity.
The real test came when Sarah decided to move beyond cellular studies and attempt trials with living subjects. She started small, with samples of her own tissue. Using a sterile scalpel, she made tiny incisions on her forearm and treated half of them with diluted vine sap while leaving the others to heal naturally. The results were visible within hours and undeniable within days. The treated wounds healed at nearly 3 times the normal rate, with minimal scarring and no signs of infection. Emboldened by these results, Sarah expanded her testing to include more complex tissue samples. She had maintained connections with several veterinary clinics from her pharmaceutical days, and she convinced Dr. Amanda Foster, an old colleague who now ran a practice in nearby Montpelier, to provide her with tissue samples from animals with various degenerative conditions. Dr. Foster was skeptical, but curious enough to humor what she assumed was Sarah's midlife crisis research project. The results with animal tissue samples were even more dramatic than Sarah had dared to hope. Liver tissue from a dog with hepatitis showed complete cellular regeneration after 48 hours of treatment with vine sap compounds. Brain tissue from a cat with feline cognitive dysfunction, essentially Alzheimer's disease in cats, demonstrated restored neural connectivity and renewed synaptic activity. Most remarkably, muscle tissue from a horse with severe muscular dystrophy began producing new, healthy muscle fibers at a rate that defied medical explanation. But it was the test with neural tissue that stopped Sarah cold and forced her to confront the true magnitude of what she had discovered. She had obtained brain tissue samples from Dr. Foster's clinic from a dog that had been euthanized due to advanced canine cognitive dysfunction. The tissue showed the characteristic protein tangles and neural degeneration that marked the condition as irreversible. Within 72 hours of treatment with Henderson's vine sap compounds, the tissue had not only stopped degenerating, but had begun to regenerate healthy neural pathways. New dendrites were forming, damaged neurons were repairing themselves, and the toxic protein accumulations that characterized the disease were being cleared away by the tissue's own cellular machinery. Sarah sat in her laboratory at 3 a.m, staring at the microscope slides that contained what might have been the first effective treatment for neurodegenerative diseases ever developed. She thought of David, of the thousands of people currently dying from Huntington's, Parkinson's, ALS, and Alzheimer's disease. She thought of the families watching their loved ones disappear piece by piece, just as she had watched David slip away. And she realized that she was holding in her hands something that could change everything. But she also realized that she was completely alone with this discovery and that the magnitude of what she had found was far beyond anything she could handle by herself. She needed help, scientific collaboration, independent verification, resources to conduct proper clinical trials. But Henderson's journals had made it clear what happened to researchers who tried to share discoveries that threatened established pharmaceutical interests.
The question was whether the medical landscape had changed enough in the 30 years since Henderson's death to allow for a different outcome. That question became more pressing when Sarah discovered that she was no longer as alone in her research as she had thought. It started with small things, tire tracks in the mud near the cottage that hadn't been there the night before, the sense of being watched when she walked to the conservatory in the early morning darkness, phone calls to her old apartment in Boston from numbers that showed up as blocked on her caller ID. She told herself it was paranoia, the natural result of spending too much time alone with Henderson's increasingly frightened journal entries. But paranoia became harder to dismiss when Dr. Foster called with disturbing news. Someone had been asking questions at her veterinary clinic about Sarah's research. The Inquirer had claimed to be from a medical journal interested in profiling Sarah's transition from pharmaceutical research to botanical studies. But Dr. Foster found the questions strangely specific and the person asking them strangely reluctant to provide credentials or explain how they had learned about Sarah's work. "Sarah, I don't know what you've gotten yourself into," Dr. Foster said during a late-night phone call, "but someone is very interested in what you're doing, and their interest doesn't feel friendly." That same week, Sarah discovered that someone had been inside the conservatory during her absence. Nothing had been taken, but things had been moved. Microscope slides had been rearranged, journal pages had been photographed. She could tell because the pages didn't fall back into their natural positions. And most disturbingly of all, someone had collected samples from the Lazarus vines. The cuts were clean and professional, made by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. The realization that her work was being monitored forced her to make a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. If powerful interests were already aware of her discovery, if they were already positioning themselves to either co-opt or suppress her research, then her only protection lay in making her findings public as quickly as possible. She couldn't wait for perfect data or ideal conditions. She needed to get her discovery into the hands of people who could protect and develop it before it disappeared into the same corporate black hole that had swallowed Henderson's work. But going public would require more than just scientific data. She would need proof that could withstand the inevitable attacks on her credibility. Evidence that was so compelling that it couldn't be dismissed or buried. Most importantly, she would need living subjects, human volunteers willing to test a treatment that existed outside the established medical system and might never receive official approval.
As Sarah sat in Henderson's old laboratory, surrounded by test tubes of luminescent vine sap and microscope slides showing impossible cellular regeneration, she realized that she had reached the same crossroads that had faced Henderson 30 years earlier. She could try to work within the system, seeking official approval and institutional support, knowing that powerful interests would likely crush her work before it ever reached the public. Or she could step outside the system entirely, accepting the risks and consequences of conducting unauthorized human trials with an unproven treatment. The decision, when it came, was easier than she had expected. She thought of David, of Dr. Foster's animal patients who had shown remarkable improvement, of the thousands of people who were dying while potentially life-saving treatments gathered dust in corporate filing cabinets. She thought of Henderson's final, frightened journal entries and his desperate hope that someone would someday finish what he had begun. Sarah Mitchell had come to the conservatory looking for redemption and purpose. Now she realized that she had found something much more dangerous and much more valuable. She had found a cause worth risking everything for. The question was no longer whether she had the courage to continue Henderson's work. The question was whether she could find a way to succeed where Henderson had failed, and whether she could do it before the same forces that had silenced him turned their attention to her. The real work, she realized, was just beginning, and this time she wouldn't be working alone. The letter arrived on a gray December morning, delivered not by the postal service, but by a man in an expensive suit who knocked on Sarah's cottage door at 7:30, introduced himself as Thomas Blackwood from Meridian Pharmaceuticals' legal department, and handed her an official-looking envelope before walking away without another word. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it, though she had been expecting something like this for weeks. The letter was brief and to the point. "Dr. Mitchell, it has come to our attention that you may be in possession of proprietary research materials that belong to Meridian Pharmaceuticals.
We demand the immediate return of all samples, data, and documentation related to compound series MX2847, commonly referred to in your former research as Brazilian moss derivatives. Failure to comply within 72 hours will result in criminal prosecution for theft of corporate intellectual property. The letter was signed by Meridian's chief legal officer and copied to what appeared to be half the pharmaceutical industry's legal departments. But what chilled Sarah most was not the threat of prosecution. She had expected that. What frightened her was the reference to MX2847. She had never used that designation in any of her work. It was an internal Meridian code that had been assigned to her Huntington's research, a code that should have been buried in classified corporate files. The fact that they were connecting her current work to her previous research meant they knew far more about what she was doing than she had realized. More disturbing still was the timing. Sarah had just finished preparing for what she had decided would be her first human trial of the vine sap compounds. After weeks of internal debate and sleepless nights, she had finally contacted someone who might be willing to serve as a test subject. Margaret Chen, a 63-year-old retired teacher from Burlington who had been diagnosed with early-stage Huntington's disease 18 months earlier. Sarah had found Margaret through a Huntington's disease support group online. She had posted a message that had broken her heart. "I watched my mother die from this disease when I was 20. I watched my sister die from it 5 years ago. Now it's my turn. The doctors say I have maybe 2 years before the symptoms become severe, 5 years at most before the end. I'm not afraid of dying, but I am afraid of dying the way they did, losing pieces of myself until there's nothing left. If anyone out there is working on treatments that aren't available through normal channels, if anyone needs volunteers for experimental trials, I'm willing to try anything. I have nothing left to lose." Sarah had stared at that message for hours before finally sending a carefully worded private reply. She had been vague about details, mentioning only that she was conducting research into plant-based treatments for neurodegenerative diseases, and asking if Margaret might be interested in learning more. The response had come back within an hour. "When can we meet?" Now, 3 weeks later, Margaret was scheduled to arrive at the conservatory that afternoon for what Sarah had planned as an initial consultation. They would discuss the risks, and there were enormous risks, since Sarah's treatment had never been tested on humans and existed completely outside the established medical system. They would review Margaret's medical history, conduct baseline tests, and if Margaret was still willing, begin a carefully monitored protocol treatment that might either save her life or kill her. But the letter from Meridian changed everything. If they were monitoring Sarah close enough to know about her current research, they almost certainly knew about Margaret's planned visit. Sarah found herself facing an impossible choice: abandon the human trial that might prove her treatment's effectiveness, or proceed knowing that she was potentially putting both herself and Margaret in legal jeopardy. The decision was made for her when her phone rang at 10:30 that morning. The caller identified herself as Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the Vermont Department of Health. "Dr. Mitchell, we've received a complaint about unauthorized medical research being conducted at your property. I'm calling to inform you that we're required by law to investigate any reports of unlicensed medical trials involving human subjects. We'll need to schedule an inspection of your facility within the next 48 hours.
Sarah's heart sank. Someone, almost certainly Meridian Pharmaceuticals, had contacted state health authorities to shut down her research before it could even begin. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. They had waited until she was on the verge of human trials, then struck with surgical precision to neutralize her work without drawing public attention to what she had discovered. But as Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that her opponents had made a crucial miscalculation. They had assumed she would back down, that the threat of legal action and regulatory investigation would be enough to make her abandon her research. They didn't understand that she had already lost everything that mattered to her: her career, her financial security, her comfortable life. They didn't understand that having nothing left to lose could make someone dangerous. Margaret Chen arrived at 2 o'clock that afternoon, driving herself in a battered Honda Civic despite the early symptoms of Huntington's disease that had already begun to affect her motor control. She was smaller than Sarah had expected, barely 5 feet tall, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that held the kind of quiet courage that comes from facing the unthinkable. "So," Margaret said as she sat in the cottage's small living room, accepting a cup of tea with hands that showed the faint tremor characteristic of early Huntington's, "tell me about this miracle cure you found." Sarah had practiced this conversation in her head dozens of times, but facing Margaret in person made everything more real and more urgent. She explained about Henderson's research, about the Lazarus vines, about the remarkable cellular regeneration she had observed in tissue samples. She was honest about the risks, about the fact that her treatment had never been tested on humans, about the legal and medical dangers they would both face if they proceeded. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking technical questions that revealed a sharp intelligence behind her quiet demeanor. When Sarah finished, Margaret was silent for a long moment, staring out the cottage's window at the conservatory's glass peaks. "My mother spent her last 2 years in a care facility. She couldn't walk, couldn't speak, couldn't recognize me or my sister. The disease took everything that made her who she was, but it left her body alive for months after her mind was gone. My sister chose differently. She ended her life while she still could, before the disease took her dignity along with everything else." Margaret turned to face Sarah directly. "I'm not ready to make either of those choices. If there's even a small chance that your treatment could give me more time as myself, then I want to try it." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. She had found someone brave enough to take the risk, but that also meant she was now responsible for Margaret's life. "There's something else you need to know," she said, and explained about the letter from Meridian, about the pending investigation from the state health department. "If we do this, we'll be breaking federal and state laws. You could face prosecution, and I could face criminal charges." Margaret's response surprised her. Instead of backing down, the older woman smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from her. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm a retired high school teacher who's dying of an incurable disease. What are they going to do to me that's worse than what's already happening?" That evening, working by lamplight in Henderson's old laboratory, Sarah prepared the first human dose of the vine sap compounds. She had calculated the dosage based on body weight extrapolations from her animal trials, but she knew she was essentially guessing. The treatment protocol would begin with a topical application, a concentrated extract applied to a small patch of Margaret's skin to test for adverse reactions. If that went well, they would proceed to subcutaneous injections, then eventually to intravenous administration if Margaret continued to show positive responses. Margaret had agreed to stay in the cottage's spare room for the first week of treatment, allowing Sarah to monitor her condition around the clock. They had established a code phrase. If Margaret said she was thinking about her garden, it meant she was experiencing serious side effects and wanted to discontinue the treatment immediately. As Sarah prepared the first dose, she thought about Henderson's final journal entries, about his fear and isolation, about his conviction that powerful interests would stop at nothing to suppress discoveries that threatened their control. She realized that she was about to cross a line that would put her permanently outside the established medical system. After tomorrow, she would no longer be a researcher conducting botanical studies. She would be someone providing unlicensed medical treatment to desperate patients, operating entirely outside the law. But as she hung up the phone, she realized that her opponents had made a crucial miscalculation. They had assumed she would back down, that the threat of legal action and regulatory investigation would be enough to make her abandon her research. They didn't understand that she had already lost everything that mattered to her: her career, her financial security, her comfortable life. They didn't understand that having nothing left to lose could make someone dangerous. Margaret Chen arrived at 2 o'clock that afternoon, driving herself in a battered Honda Civic despite the early symptoms of Huntington's disease that had already begun to affect her motor control. She was smaller than Sarah had expected, barely 5 feet tall, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that held the kind of quiet courage that comes from facing the unthinkable. "So," Margaret said as she sat in the cottage's small living room, accepting a cup of tea with hands that showed the faint tremor characteristic of early Huntington's, "tell me about this miracle cure you found." Sarah had practiced this conversation in her head dozens of times, but facing Margaret in person made everything more real and more urgent. She explained about Henderson's research, about the Lazarus vines, about the remarkable cellular regeneration she had observed in tissue samples. She was honest about the risks, about the fact that her treatment had never been tested on humans, about the legal and medical dangers they would both face if they proceeded. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking technical questions that revealed a sharp intelligence behind her quiet demeanor. When Sarah finished, Margaret was silent for a long moment, staring out the cottage's window at the conservatory's glass peaks. "My mother spent her last 2 years in a care facility. She couldn't walk, couldn't speak, couldn't recognize me or my sister. The disease took everything that made her who she was, but it left her body alive for months after her mind was gone. My sister chose differently. She ended her life while she still could, before the disease took her dignity along with everything else." Margaret turned to face Sarah directly. "I'm not ready to make either of those choices. If there's even a small chance that your treatment could give me more time as myself, then I want to try it." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. She had found someone brave enough to take the risk, but that also meant she was now responsible for Margaret's life. "There's something else you need to know," she said, and explained about the letter from Meridian, about the pending investigation from the state health department. "If we do this, we'll be breaking federal and state laws. You could face prosecution, and I could face criminal charges." Margaret's response surprised her. Instead of backing down, the older woman smiled. The first genuine smile Sarah had seen from her. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm a retired high school teacher who's dying of an incurable disease. What are they going to do to me that's worse than what's already happening?"
The real test was about to begin, and this time there would be no laboratory animals to absorb the risk, no corporate oversight committee to share the responsibility. Just 2 women, a greenhouse full of impossible plants, and the ghost of a dead botanist who had dared to believe that nature's secrets were worth any price. The first 24 hours passed without incident. Margaret slept peacefully in the cottage's spare room, while Sarah maintained a vigil from the kitchen table, checking on her patient every 2 hours and documenting every detail in a notebook that she knew might someday serve as evidence in a criminal trial. The patch of skin where she had applied the vine extract showed no signs of irritation, no redness or swelling that might indicate an allergic reaction. But on the second day, something remarkable began to happen. Margaret woke with more energy than she had experienced in months. The tremor in her hands, which had been gradually worsening over the past year, was noticeably reduced. More significantly, her balance and coordination, 2 of the first casualties of Huntington's disease, seemed markedly improved. She walked to the kitchen without the careful, hesitant steps that had characterized her movement the day before. "I feel different," Margaret said as she sat down for breakfast, her voice filled with wonder. "Not just better, different, like my body is remembering how to work properly." Sarah tried to contain her excitement, reminding herself that early improvements could be psychological, temporary, or coincidental. But as she conducted her morning neurological assessment, a series of simple tests she had devised to measure Margaret's cognitive function, motor control, and reflexes, the results were undeniable. Margaret's scores had improved across every category, some by margins that would have been considered impossible in conventional medicine.
By the third day, the improvements were so dramatic that Sarah began to question her own observations. Margaret's tremor had virtually disappeared. Her gait was steady and confident. Most remarkably, her cognitive tests suggested that the disease's early effects on her mental function were not just stabilizing, but actually reversing. I called my daughter this morning. For the first time in months, I didn't have to struggle to find the right words. I didn't lose my train of thought halfway through sentences. She said I sounded more like myself than I have since the diagnosis. Sarah documented every change meticulously, taking blood samples for analysis, recording video assessments of Margaret's motor function, and conducting increasingly sophisticated neurological tests with equipment she had improvised from Henderson's old laboratory supplies. The evidence was mounting that Henderson's vine sap compounds weren't just treating Margaret's symptoms, they appeared to be reversing the fundamental cellular damage that caused Huntington's disease. But their isolation was about to end dramatically. On Thursday morning, Sarah awoke to the sound of vehicles in the gravel drive outside the cottage. Through the window, she could see 2 black SUVs and a van marked with the Vermont Department of Health logo. Men in dark suits were already walking toward the conservatory, while others approached the cottage. "Margaret," Sarah called quietly, her heart racing. "We have company." The knock on the door was firm and authoritative. Sarah opened it to find Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the health department, flanked by 2 federal agents who introduced themselves as being from the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations. Behind them stood Thomas Blackwood, the Meridian pharmaceutical lawyer who had delivered the cease and desist letter days earlier. "Dr. Mitchell," Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice professionally neutral, but not unfriendly, "we have a warrant to inspect your facilities and investigate reports of unauthorized medical experimentation. We're also required to interview any individuals who may have been subjects of unlicensed clinical trials." Sarah's mind raced. She anticipated this moment, but had hoped for more time to document Margaret's progress. "I'd like to see the warrant," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. As Dr. Rodriguez handed her the legal documents, Sarah caught sight of Margaret standing in the kitchen doorway, but the woman she saw bore little resemblance to the frail, trembling patient who had arrived just days earlier. Margaret stood straight and confident, her movements fluid and precise, her eyes alert and focused. The transformation was so complete that Sarah wondered if the investigators would even believe that this was the same person who had been diagnosed with Huntington's disease. "Are you Margaret Chen?" one of the FDA agents asked, consulting a tablet computer. "I am," Margaret replied, her voice clear and strong. "Ma'am, we understand you may have been participating in unauthorized medical trials. We need to ask you some questions about any treatments you may have received." Margaret looked directly at the agent, then at Sarah, then back at the agent. "I came here of my own free will to explore alternative treatments for a terminal illness. Dr. Mitchell has been nothing but professional and ethical in her approach to my care." Thomas Blackwood stepped forward, his expression predatory. "Miss Chen, you may not be aware that Dr. Mitchell is using stolen proprietary compounds in her so-called treatments. Any improvements you think you've experienced are likely placebo effects or temporary responses that could be masking underlying damage." It was then that Margaret did something that surprised everyone present, including Sarah. She laughed, a genuine, delighted laugh that seemed to fill the small cottage with warmth. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm a retired science teacher. I understand the concept of placebo effects. I also understand the progression of Huntington's disease, having watched it kill both my mother and my sister. What I've experienced over the past 3 days isn't a placebo effect. It's the first time in over a year that I've felt like myself."
As if to demonstrate her point, Margaret walked to the cottage's small piano, an old upright that had come with the property, and sat down at the bench. "I haven't been able to play in 8 months," she said.
positioning her hands over the keys. The tremors and coordination problems made it impossible. She began to play Chopin's Minute Waltz, her fingers moving across the keys with a precision and fluidity that would have been remarkable for someone half her age, let alone someone supposedly suffering from a degenerative neurological disease. The music filled the cottage with crystalline beauty, and Sarah saw several of the investigators exchange glances of confusion and concern. When Margaret finished, she turned to face the group with a smile. "Gentlemen, I don't know what legal issues you think you're dealing with here, but from a medical standpoint, I can tell you that whatever Dr. Mitchell has discovered is the most effective treatment for Huntington's disease I've ever encountered. And I've encountered quite a few over the years." The federal agents huddled with Dr. Rodriguez and the Meridian lawyer for several minutes, their conversation too quiet for Sarah to overhear. She could see them looking between Margaret and their official paperwork, clearly struggling to reconcile what they were witnessing with what they had expected to find. Finally, Dr. Rodriguez approached Sarah with an expression that mixed professional duty with genuine curiosity. "Dr. Mitchell, we're going to need to conduct a full inspection of your facilities and review all of your research documentation. We're also going to need Ms. Chen to undergo a complete medical evaluation by an independent physician to assess her current condition. I understand, but I want to make something clear. Nothing I've done here violates the fundamental principles of medical ethics. I've worked with informed consent, I've prioritized patient safety, and I've documented everything meticulously. If there are regulatory issues, we can address those. But please don't let bureaucratic concerns prevent you from seeing what we've accomplished here." Thomas Blackwood stepped forward again, his face flushed with anger. "Dr. Mitchell, you're in possession of stolen intellectual property belonging to Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Whatever tricks you're using to create temporary improvements in Ms. Chen's condition, they're based on research that doesn't belong to you." Sarah felt something snap inside her. For months, she had been patient, diplomatic, willing to work within the system despite its obvious flaws. But watching Margaret's remarkable recovery being dismissed as tricks by a corporate lawyer whose company had suppressed potentially life-saving research pushed her beyond her limits. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice quiet but filled with steel, "I developed the Brazilian moss compounds that Meridian buried 2 years ago. I created that research. I documented it, and I watched your company kill it because the patient population wasn't large enough to generate acceptable profits. What I've discovered here has nothing to do with that work and everything to do with continuing research that your company abandoned when it became inconvenient." She gestured toward Margaret, who was now chatting with one of the federal agents about the technical aspects of Huntington's disease progression. "That woman was dying 6 months ago. Today, she's playing Chopin and discussing neurochemistry. If you want to call that a trick, that's your choice. But I call it medicine." The confrontation was interrupted by Dr. Rodriguez, who had been examining Sarah's research documentation with growing amazement. "Dr. Mitchell, these cellular regeneration studies, are these results verified?" "Every test has been repeated multiple times. Every result has been documented and photographed. I know this work won't meet FDA standards for clinical trials, but the science is solid." Dr. Rodriguez looked up from the notebooks with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. "Dr. Mitchell, I think we need to have a longer conversation about what you've discovered here, and I think we need to have it before any decisions about shutting down your research." Sarah felt a flicker of hope for the first time since the investigators had arrived. But she also noticed Thomas Blackwood making a quiet phone call near his vehicle, his expression growing more agitated by the minute. Whatever was happening here was far from over, and Sarah suspected that the forces arrayed against her discovery were just beginning to mobilize. Margaret's miraculous recovery had bought them time and credibility, but it also made Sarah's work impossible to ignore.
Now the question was whether the truth would be strong enough to survive the storm that was about to break around them. The phone call that changed everything came 3 days after the federal investigation. Sarah was in the conservatory at dawn, tending to the Lazarus vines that had become more precious than gold, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Victoria Hartwell, Senior Vice President of Research and Development at Meridian Pharmaceuticals. I believe we need to talk." Sarah's blood ran cold. She had heard of Victoria Hartwell. Everyone in pharmaceutical research had. Known as the negotiator, Hartwell was Meridian's top executive when it came to acquiring promising research from smaller competitors, or when necessary, neutralizing threats to the company's market position. The fact that she was calling personally meant Sarah's discovery had reached the highest levels of corporate attention. "Miss Hartwell, I'm not sure we have anything to discuss." "Oh, but we do, Dr. Mitchell. We have a great deal to discuss. I understand you've made some remarkable discoveries in your little greenhouse project. I also understand that you've attracted some unwanted attention from federal regulators. I'd like to propose a solution that could benefit everyone involved."
The meeting was set for that afternoon at a coffee shop in Burlington, neutral ground that Hartwell suggested with the casual confidence of someone who had orchestrated hundreds of similar conversations. Sarah spent the morning in a state of controlled anxiety, knowing that whatever Hartwell proposed would likely represent her last chance to maintain control over Henderson's legacy and her own research. Margaret, who had remained at the cottage despite being cleared by the independent medical evaluation that had confirmed her remarkable recovery, insisted on driving Sarah to the meeting. "I want to see the face of the person who thinks they can buy and bury a cure for Huntington's disease," she said with the fierce determination that had characterized her since the treatment began. Victoria Hartwell was not what Sarah had expected. Instead of the corporate shark she had imagined, Sarah found herself facing a woman in her early 50s with graying hair, intelligent eyes, and the kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money and excellent education. She rose from a corner table as Sarah entered the coffee shop, extending her hand with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "Dr. Mitchell, thank you for coming. I've been following your work with great interest." Hartwell gestured to the chair across from her. "Please, sit. I think you'll find what I have to say quite compelling." Sarah sat, every nerve on edge, studying the woman who held the power to either legitimize or destroy her research. Hartwell sipped her coffee and regarded Sarah with the kind of calm appraisal that suggested she had done this many times before. "Let me be direct," Hartwell began. "What you've discovered in that conservatory is extraordinary. Our preliminary analysis of the compounds you've isolated suggests a breakthrough that could revolutionize treatment for neurodegenerative diseases. The cellular regeneration properties alone represent technology that could be worth billions of dollars in the right hands." Sarah felt her stomach clench. "And I suppose Meridian considers itself the right hands." Hartwell's smile never wavered. "We are the largest pharmaceutical research company in the world, Dr. Mitchell. We have the resources to conduct proper clinical trials, to navigate the regulatory approval process, to bring your discovery to millions of patients who need it. What we're offering you is the chance to see your work reach its full potential rather than remaining trapped in a greenhouse that federal regulators could shut down at any moment. And in return, full partnership," Hartwell said, leaning forward slightly. "You would return to Meridian as Director of Natural Compounds Research, with a budget of $50 million and a staff of your choosing. You would maintain creative control over the development process, with guaranteed publication rights for all significant findings. Most importantly, you would receive a percentage of all revenues generated by treatments based on your discovery, a percentage that could make you extremely wealthy while helping millions of people." It was, Sarah had to admit, a generous offer, far more generous than she had expected. but she also knew that corporate generosity always came with strings attached. What about the Brazilian moss research that Meridian buried? What about the patients who could have been helped if that work had continued? Hartwell's expression grew more serious. That was a different time, different leadership. The company has evolved, Dr. Mitchell. We've learned that suppressing promising research serves no one's interests, least of all our own. Your greenhouse discovery has reminded us that innovation can come from unexpected places, and we want to embrace that rather than fight it. Sarah studied Hartwell's face, looking for signs of deception but finding only what appeared to be genuine conviction. And if I refuse? The temperature in the conversation seemed to drop several degrees. Dr. Mitchell, let's be realistic about your situation. You're conducting unlicensed medical research on human subjects. You're using compounds that may or may not be derived from proprietary Meridian intellectual property. The federal investigation is just the beginning. There will be congressional hearings, medical board reviews, potential criminal charges. Even if you ultimately prevailed, the process could take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Hartwell paused, letting the implications sink in before continuing. More importantly, while you're fighting legal battles, patients are dying. People like Miss Chen, who could benefit from your discovery, are suffering through the final stages of diseases that your research might be able to treat. Is your independence really worth more than their lives? It was a masterful manipulation, and Sarah recognized it as such. But she also recognized the kernel of truth at its center. Her resources were limited, her legal position was precarious, and every day she spent fighting corporate lawyers was a day that potential patients went without treatment. I need guarantees, Sarah said finally, written guarantees that the research will continue regardless of commercial considerations, guarantees that patients will have access to treatments even if they can't afford market prices, and guarantees that Henderson's work will be properly credited and his memory honored. Hartwell nodded approvingly. All reasonable requests. Our legal team can draft agreements that address each of your concerns. In fact, I took the liberty of having our lawyers prepare preliminary contracts based on what I assumed would be your primary concerns. Sarah accepted the folder with trembling hands, knowing that the papers inside represented a crossroads that would determine not just her own future, but potentially the future of millions of patients worldwide. The contracts were comprehensive, and at first glance, remarkably favorable to her position. Meridian would fund complete clinical trials, provide legal protection against all current regulatory challenges, and guarantee that any successful treatments would be made available through patient assistance programs for those who couldn't afford market pricing.
But as she read deeper into the documentation, Sarah found the clauses that revealed the true nature of Hartwell's offer. Buried in subsection 12C was language that gave Meridian complete control over publication and disclosure of research results. Section 18 contained a non-compete clause that would prevent Sarah from conducting independent research for a period of 10 years after leaving the company. Most troubling of all, Amendment 7 included provisions for research modification or discontinuation based on market analysis and corporate strategic priorities. Sarah looked up from the contracts to find Hartwell watching her with patient expectation. These clauses essentially give Meridian the right to bury my research just as effectively as if they had never partnered with me at all. Dr. Mitchell, those are standard protection clauses. No company can commit to developing every promising research line indefinitely without regard to practical considerations. But I can assure you that Meridian has every intention of bringing your discovery to market. The same assurances you gave about the Brazilian moss research? Hartwell's facade of warmth finally cracked slightly. Dr. Mitchell, you are being offered an opportunity that most researchers would kill for. The alternative is to fight a battle you cannot win while patients die waiting for treatments you cannot provide. I suggest you consider which choice serves the greater good. Sarah closed the folder and stood from the table. Miss Hartwell, I appreciate your offer, but I need time to consider all the implications.
This isn't just about my research, it's about ensuring that Henderson's work leads to real treatments for real patients, not just profits for pharmaceutical companies. Hartwell's professional mask slipped back into place. Of course, but please don't take too long to decide. The federal investigation is gaining momentum, and our ability to provide protection becomes more limited with each passing day. As Sarah walked toward the coffee shop exit, Hartwell called out one final time. Dr. Mitchell, you should know that we're not the only pharmaceutical company that's taken notice of your work. If you choose not to partner with us, others will make their own offers. And I can guarantee that none of them will be as generous or as respectful of your research integrity as ours. Sarah drove back to the conservatory in silence, Margaret beside her equally quiet, as they both processed what they had heard. The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. She could accept Hartwell's offer and ensure that her discovery reached clinical trials, but at the cost of surrendering control over how it was developed and distributed. Or she could maintain her independence and risk losing everything to legal challenges and corporate interference. That evening, as Sarah sat in Henderson's old laboratory, surrounded by the journals and specimens that had started her journey, she realized that the choice wasn't really between independence and partnership. It was between fear and faith. Fear that she wasn't strong enough to protect her discovery on her own, or faith that the truth was powerful enough to survive whatever forces were arrayed against it.
Margaret found her there at midnight, still staring at Hartwell's contracts spread across the workbench. "What are you going to do?" the older woman asked gently. Sarah looked up at her patient, her friend, her living proof that Henderson's work could save lives. Margaret's transformation over the past week had been nothing short of miraculous, but more importantly, it had been real. No corporate manipulation, no marketing strategy, no profit margin could diminish the simple fact that a woman who had been dying was now fully alive. "I'm going to do what Henderson should have done 30 years ago," Sarah said, gathering the contracts into a neat pile. "I'm going to trust people to recognize the truth when they see it, even if powerful interests don't want them to." The next morning, Sarah called Dr. Rodriguez at the Vermont Department of Health and asked for a meeting with the federal investigators. It was time to tell the complete story of her discovery, to provide full documentation of Margaret's treatment and recovery, and to formally request governmental protection for research that served the public interest rather than corporate profits. She also made another call to Dr. Amanda Foster, asking her veterinarian friend to help her contact medical researchers at universities across the country who might be interested in conducting independent verification of her results. If Meridian wanted to suppress her work, they would have to suppress dozens of research institutions simultaneously. Most importantly, she called a journalist she had known during her corporate days, someone who specialized in pharmaceutical industry investigations. If her discovery was going to survive, it would need the protection that only public attention could provide. Margaret Mitchell had come to the conservatory seeking redemption and purpose. She had found something far more valuable and far more dangerous. She had found the power to heal diseases that modern medicine had declared incurable. Now she faced the ultimate test of whether that power could survive in a world where healing was often subordinated to profit. The battle for Henderson's legacy was about to begin in earnest, and this time, Sarah was ready to fight it in the light rather than hiding in the shadows of an abandoned greenhouse. The future of countless patients hung in the balance, but, for the first time since her corporate exile began, Sarah felt she had the weapon she needed to win. The story of the woman who bought an abandoned greenhouse and found a cure for an incurable disease was about to become public. And once it was public, no corporation, no matter how powerful, would be able to make it disappear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.